If you're into watches, you've probably heard the debates about Rolex alternatives. It's a hot topic that never seems to cool down. Today, we're going to look at this debate from a different angle. We're going to use a scientific approach to settle this once and for all. How? By calculating something the economists call the substitution effect. Sounds interesting, right? Well, stick around. We're about to dive into 5 popular watch brands that often come up in these discussions. By the end of this video, you'll have a fresh perspective on the whole Rolex alternative debate. Let's get started. Now, let me quickly explain how we're going to tackle this debate. I've come up with a new way to look at this using real sales and price data from 2017 to 2024. We'll be using 3 key metrics. Let's break them down. First, there's RPCR. That's relative price change ratio. Imagine a seesaw. Rolex on one end and its competitors are on the other. If the Rolex end is higher, it means Rolex prices increase more than its competitors. The steeper the tilt, the bigger the difference in price changes. Next, we have lack of substitution. Picture a funnel. The wide top represents all the customers who might switch brands due to price changes. Rolex prices going up. The narrow bottom, that's the few who actually do make the switch. A skinny bottom means high brand loyalty and low substitution. And finally, the third metric, there's brand loyalty factor, BLF. Think of this like a big magnet. The stronger the magnet, the more it pulls customers in, even when prices go up. A high BLF means customers stick with Rolex despite price differences. This is a key metric. The higher the number, the more people are loyal to Rolex. In fact, the BLF has to be below 50 to show any real substitution effect, meaning customers consider another brand a true Rolex alternative. These metrics will help us see if people really switch from Rolex to other brands when prices go up. We're looking at a time when luxury watches were in high demand. This method gives us solid numbers to work with. No more guessing. We're going to settle this debate with data. Are you ready to dive in? Let's look at our first brand comparison. Starting with Omega, often seen as Rolex's closest competitor. Look at these numbers. Omega's prices went up by 25.4%. That's a big jump. But here's the kicker. Rolex prices went up even more by 72%. Our PCR is 2.83. Remember the seesaw? It's tilting pretty hard toward Rolex. This means Rolex prices increased almost 3 times more than Omega's. You'd think this would make people switch to Omega, right? Well, not really. Look at the lack of substitution is 90%. That funnel we're talking about is pretty skinny at the bottom. Even with Rolex getting much pricier, hardly anyone switched to Omega. The brand loyalty factor is 203. That's one strong magnet pulling Rolex customers in. So what does this mean for the whole Rolex alternative debate? Sure, Omega makes great watches, but our data shows it's not really a substitute for Rolex. Rolex buyers seem happy to pay those higher prices, instead of switching. Omega isn't really a Rolex alternative. It's its own thing in the watch world. Now, let's look at Tudor, often called Rolex's sister brand. Check out these numbers. Tudor's prices went up by 3.1%. Compare that to Rolex 72% increase. That's a huge difference. So the RPCR here is a massive 23 times. Remember our seesaw? It's practically vertical now. This means Rolex prices increased over 23 times more than Tudor's. Incredible. You'd think this would make people flock to Tudor, right? But look closer. The lack of substitution is 86.7%. Our tunnel is still very narrow at the bottom. Even with this enormous price gap, most people aren't switching to Tudor. And the brand loyalty factor is off the charts at 1,158. That Rolex magnet is real. So what does this mean for the Rolex alternative debate? Tudor is often marketed as a more affordable Rolex alternative, but our data tells a different story. Even though Tudor barely raised prices and Rolex prices skyrocketed, Rolex buyers are not switching. This tells us that Tudor and Rolex, despite being sister brands, are in completely different leagues for customers. Tudor isn't the Rolex alternative. Again, it's its own thing. They make quality watches. I'm actually a fan. And the reason for this, I did a deep dive video to explain this. I'll drop a link so you can check it out below. All right, so let's analyze Cartier as our next brand, another big name in luxury watches. These numbers show secondary market price movements reflecting real market demand. Cartier's pre-owned prices barely budged, going up 0.8%. Compare that to Rolex's whopping 72% increase in the same time period. That's a massive difference. Our RPCR here is an incredible 62.5. Our seesaw is practically a vertical line now. This means Rolex's secondary prices shot up over 62 times more than Cartier's. That's mind-blowing. You'd think this would make people rush to Cartier instead of Rolex, right? But look closer. The lack of substitution is 87.5%. Our funnel is extremely narrow at the bottom. Even with this enormous price gap in the pre-owned market, people aren't switching from Rolex to Cartier. The brand loyalty factor is an astronomical 4,167. Wow. The Rolex magnet is unbreakable. It won't let their customers get away. So what does this mean for the Rolex alternative debate with regards to Cartier? Cartier is a luxury brand in its own right, but our data shows it is not a Rolex substitute. People don't consider it the same way. Even though pre-owned Cartier prices stay stable and Rolex prices skyrocketed, buyers are not switching. Cartier isn't a Rolex alternative in consumers' minds. They do make great watches, but this data really challenges the idea of any luxury watch being a true Rolex substitute. Let's look at Tag Heuer, another well-known luxury brand some people consider maybe a Rolex alternative. Remember, these numbers show secondary market price movements reflecting real demand. Interestingly, Tag Heuer's pre-owned prices actually drop by 0.7%. Compare that to, again, Rolex's massive 72% increase. The difference is huge. So our RPCR here is a negative 103. Wow. Our seesaw analogy doesn't even work anymore. This means while Rolex prices skyrocketed, Tag Heuer prices slightly declined. It's a complete opposite trend. You'd think this, price gap would make people flock to Tag Heuer instead of Rolex, right? Look closer. The lack of substitution is still high at 85%. Our funnel remains very narrow at the bottom. Even with Tag Heuer becoming relatively cheaper, prices are dropping. People are not switching away from Rolex. The brand loyalty factor is a whopping 4,819. That Rolex magnet keeps getting stronger. So what does this mean for the Rolex alternative debate for Tag Heuer? Tag Heuer is certainly a respected brand, but our data shows it's not a substitute in consumer minds. So even though pre-owned Tag Heuer prices slightly drop while Rolex prices soared, buyers aren't switching. This tells us that Tag Heuer and Rolex, despite both being in the luxury market, serve very different customer needs. Tag Heuer isn't seen as a Rolex alternative in the secondary market. This data further reinforces the idea that finding a true Rolex substitute is harder than it seems. Now, let's look at our last brand. This gets the closest actually to a Rolex alternative, and it's Breitling. Yes, surprisingly, the data shows that Breitling is actually the closest. It's another major player in luxury watches. Look at this. Breitling's pre-owned prices dropped by a substantial 10%. Compare that to Rolex's 72% increase in the secondary market. The difference is staggering. Our RPC is negative again at -7. Our seesaw has completely flipped. This means while Rolex prices shot up, yes, Breitling prices took a significant dive. And you would think this massive price gap would make people abandon Rolex for Breitling, right? But again, let's take a closer look. The lack of substitution is again high at 84%. Our funnel remains very narrow at the bottom. Even with Breitling becoming much cheaper relative to Rolex, people aren't making the switch. The brand loyalty factor is wins. So that is the closest among all the 5 brands that we've looked at, but it's still not there. This is the closest we've gotten to a true Rolex alternative. But remember, we need a BLF that is less than 50 to show real substitution. Customers are still showing strong loyalty to Rolex. So, what does this mean for the Rolex alternative debate? Breitling, yes, is a respected brand, but our data shows it's not a Rolex substitute in the buyer's minds. This data drives home the point. Finding a true Rolex substitute seems nearly impossible. So, watch enthusiasts. We've crunched the numbers and it's time to draw some conclusions. We looked at Omega, Tudor, Cartier, Tag Heuer, and Breitling, all brands often touted as Rolex alternatives. But what did our data show us? It tells us that Rolex occupies a unique position in the watch market. Rolex buyers aren't just buying a watch, they're buying into the Rolex brand itself. That's the truth. This behavior is typical of what economists call Veblen goods. Luxury items where demand increases as the price increases. Our data provides strong evidence that none of these so-called alternatives are true substitute for Rolex in the minds of consumers. Each brand we looked at seems to occupy its own space in the market, serving different customer needs and preferences. So the next time you hear someone talking about, Rolex alternative, remember this analysis. In the world of luxury watches, Rolex truly stands alone. See you in the next video.